Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org. We continue our podcast about the war which Russia started against Ukraine. This series is brought to you by Internews Ukraine and Ukraine Crisis Media Center, two Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. We are making this podcast with Tetyana Ogarkova, who is in charge of international outreach at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Hello, Tanya.
Hello, Volodya.
Before we start, let me remind you that you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. So we are at 24th of March, and there is precisely 1 month since Russia started its war against Ukraine, and we will try to analyze what happened in this 1 month, analyze the key lessons that we can draw from this war, from these months. And let's proceed, Tanya. So what is the first lesson for you?
Yeah, I think that the first lesson we've learned during these months is that, and we all were very much surprised by the fact that Ukrainian army is much stronger than we believed it to be several months ago. So nobody could expect that the Ukrainian army, which is much smaller than the Russian one, could be able to resist in such a strong manner. We do know now that the initial plan of Russian army was to take the country in a couple of days, and that's why they attacked the capital. And their plan was to take Kiev and maybe President Zelensky, something like that, in 3 days. So what we know now is that Ukrainian army is, in spite of all these rumors about corruption, about weaknesses, about lack of experience. We do remember our experience in 2014. You remember, we didn't have army at that moment. But what we see now, that Ukrainians are very much effective. And even Americans are saying now that when they deliver arms to Ukrainian army, like, for example, Stingers or Javelins, Ukrainians use these arms very much effectively, so they're capable to resist. That's one thing. And the same thing is maybe about Russian army.
Yeah, I would like to add just that we have the jokes right now, right, in Ukraine, that it has been a month since Russians planned to capture Kiev in 3 days. Yeah, and they're capturing Kiev in 3 days, and doing that for 1 month already. And indeed, one of the lessons is that the Russian army is not that strong. And the second strongest army in the world is actually what we are seeing is full of incompetent people, incompetent generals, colonels, leaders, who are basically sending people without even giving them tasks, with very old equipment, with very old tanks, and many of them are just, scared boys, young scared boys. Of course, it's not everybody, because Russian army, is doing cruelties and atrocities, and many of them are trained professionals in killing and destroying. But what we see is that Russian army is stalled, so it's not moving too fast. And the only major city they took in 1 month is Kherson, very close to Crimea.
We are making even jokes saying that this fear of Russian army, of Red Army's ancient Soviet army. Now we see what this army looks like when it fights without Ukrainians and against Ukrainians. So it's not so much effective. But at the same time, we also see the reasons why this army is not so powerful, because this is about the lack of communication between their leaders, we mean Putin, and what's going on the ground, because this is a kind of virtual army. It's about the image of that. They attacked Ukraine in many directions at the same time. It's in 7 directions, using only 150,000 people, troops, against 250,000 Ukrainian army, which was mainly in this Donbas region. So this was stupid from the very beginning, in a way. So they were so sure of themselves that they made a lot of tactical and strategic mistakes. And now what we see, they are accumulating these mistakes every day. And in a way, we understand that their project to occupy Ukraine, to I don't know, to arrest Zelensky. This is not real. They can only destroy. We'll talk about that later. But they can only destroy several cities. They can kill people, but they cannot control even the territories they already think that they conquered. For example, look at Kherson. They entered with their tanks into Kherson. There are some military present in place. What people say in the south, they call it day-long occupation. So it means that their soldiers, they are present somewhere in the center of these villages and small towns during the day, but at night they are not there. They are going somewhere, they are sleeping elsewhere, and then in the morning they come back.
They go back to Rostov and then they
something
come back.
Like that. So it looks like they are not able to occupy. We are already talking about this phenomenon of occupy. What does it mean to occupy somebody?
Yeah.
It means that you are present and then you exercise your power. And this is not exactly what Russians are doing in Kherson, because people are coming to the streets even when they are shooted. In the last day, unfortunately, we've seen that they were already shooted by wounded. There were already people wounded during this manifestation. But in a way, this is not an occupation.
Yes, and we see, for example, a huge Ukrainian flag drawn back to the city council. So, well, they're saying that the Russians are creating another Kherson Popular Republic, but suddenly there is a huge Ukrainian flag, despite the fact that they announced already their power, and there are news that they will enter rubles into the circulation, but still Ukrainians are just making their own life there.
Maybe the last joke as to this point of the strength of Ukrainian army and the weakness of Russian army is that at the moment when Russians contacted China, asking, as we presume, for military aid, we were making jokes like the second army in the world is contacting the third army in the world because they are unable to fight against territorial defense in Gostomel. So, that's what we're talking about. The second lesson is that Russia, surprisingly, for many Ukrainians, is ready to destroy Ukraine. I mean, not only to occupy, to conquer, but to destroy physically. I mean, buildings, people, cities like Mariupol. So this is what we understand about Russia now, that they are not a real state. It's a kind of a terroristic organization, a huge terroristic organization. What they are doing in Mariupol, it's not about taking the city, because what they are trying to conquer now, they are ruins with dead bodies and some still, we hope, living people. But this is not about the city, this is about territory. And when we see, for example, this night, they were bombarding Kharkiv from the Black Sea. Imagine. So it's a huge distance. What they are doing, they're trying to destroy the city. Their troops are quite far away now from Kharkiv. They are not able to enter the city, to conquer it, but they are destroying it. And what President Zelensky told several days ago, talking to international journalists, he said that we'd like to explain to Russia that they can conquer our cities only by destroying it. So in a way, there's no, and what we have to know about Russia today, that the nature of this attack, it's not military, it is terroristic attack.
Exactly, because what is terrorism is just when you destroy the space of safety, right? When nobody can feel safe anywhere, when the attack can be anywhere, unexpected. This is what's happening with this missiles war. Because while the war in Donbass was an artillery war, also very tragic, and losses on both sides, and it's important to remember it, of course. But now it's just unilateral missiles war from Russia against the Ukrainian cities, and during this war you can be anywhere. You can be in Kharkiv, you can be in Kiev, you can be a Russian citizen in Kiev. By the way, yesterday a Russian journalist was killed by a Russian missile. You can be in Lviv, you can be anywhere, you can be sleeping at night, and suddenly, without you hearing anything, any missiles approaching, it's just bump, and probably you're dead, or your apartment is destroyed, or you're wounded. And this is what happening indeed. So Russians are really showing their destructive destructive instincts. And once I wrote an article called Sadoputinism. So this sounds very probably strong for our international audience, but you should understand probably this psychology. The psychology of Russia, current Russia, is that they really cannot take Ukraine back. It's just impossible. Here you have 100%, 110%, whatever you can call, of people against Russia.
So, angry with Russia.
Angry about Russia. Primarily the Russian-speaking cities of Kharkiv, Mariupol, Kherson, etc. They are just hating Russians, despite the fact that they are Russian-speaking, etc. And Russians, I mean, they cannot influence it. They cannot have a cultural influence it on Ukrainians anymore, and they're just destroying it.
And
massively.
it's a political influence, so it is not cultural, not political, but it's only pure destruction. So to sum it up, so Russia is ready to destroy, just to destroy it, because we don't see the reason. They will need it. I don't know what are they thinking about? How much money they will need to build here something? What the point, in fact, for them?
They are not thinking about it. And in Ukrainian history, we have lots of these examples. For example, when they're just destroying everything. One of the examples is one of the Cossack capitals, Baturin. When, for example, when Ukrainian hetman Ivan Mazepa tried to make a rebellion against Russian Tsar Peter I. Baturin was absolutely destroyed, and the people were massacred. So I think this is the logic right now. They are saying that all Ukrainians are Nazi, all Ukrainians who are anti-Russian are Nazi, therefore they should be annihilated physically. So we come to the third point, and our third lesson is that it's not a Putin's war. Don't call it Putin's war. It's really a Russian war. And Russians are consolidated around Putin. We have 71 to 75%, according to different polls, of Russians aligning themselves with this war. Of course, there are dissidents. Of course, there are people who don't agree, but they are in big minority. And we should just understand it's not only about the bad Putin. Don't be naive. Don't live in this illusion.
Yeah, that's right. And another lesson linked to this one is that propaganda is effective. And we could not imagine how we live not in the 20th century where it was much more easier to control people with propaganda. But what we see that in a free world, because Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, they were banned in Russia, but they were banned just a couple of days ago, a couple of weeks ago. And before, they had all access to information, but at the same time, quite surprisingly, a minority in Russia is able to think critically and to understand that what their country and their government is really doing. So this is something surprising for us, because we Ukrainians, we just don't understand how we can be silly enough to trust all these patriotic narratives, all these narratives against a neighboring country, about fascists, about banderivci, etc., etc. So the lesson is that propaganda is really effective in a modern 21st century.
And just listen to those Russians who support this. We at UkraineWorld are receiving some of the comments from these Russians, who might appear educated people, English speaking. And you just read them, and it's a total nightmare. So people are aware that Russians are bombing Ukrainian cities. People are aware that this is a missiles war, but still they're thinking that this is all right. It's what they think. It's a revenge against the Donbass war. But again, the Donbass war, it's a very tragic things, and with losses on both sides. Artillery war with no precise weapons. But again, who started this war? Russia.
Yeah.
Ukrainian army is, of course, was defending itself, but this artillery war, of course, caused many civilians dead, and we should also talk about it.
Yeah, but look.
But what's going on right now? It's absolutely different level, because this is a missiles war with indiscreet shelling of and destroying of cities, which is absolutely nothing to do with this local war, where there are, of course, some of the districts of cities damaged, but now you have all the cities like Mariupol, Volnovakha, Kharkiv increasingly, Chernihiv increasingly just erased from face of the earth.
Yeah, just look at what Donetsk looks like today, or Lugansk. Despite all this war for 8 years already, they are still a city. There were surely some distractions, but you cannot compare Donetsk with any kind of city, like even Kharkiv, because there were some bombing, some shelling in the suburbs, but you still have the city. And today we got to know that about 1,000 buildings are destroyed in Kharkiv only. So this is
in
huge.
just 1 month. In just 1 month.
Yeah, it's not. We are not speaking about 8 years.
But many Russians are supporting this, and because this narrative that all Ukrainians are Nazi, we see when you go on the streets. I recently watched the video by Current Time that was asking people, I think in Smolensk. And the logic is very simple. The younger the person is, the more critical he or she is to this war. But the older generation, the key basis for Putin's regime, like 50 plus, they're just saying, "What's your attitude to Ukrainians, Ukrainian army? They're not just Nazis and fascists." And this is what Russian propaganda was telling them throughout decades, not even since 2014, but earlier. They just was repeating that they're Nazis, they're fascists, they're Nazis, they're fascists. It's not only about disinformation, it's about hate speech, and it's about dehumanization. We should understand that the key objective of Russian propaganda was not even to lie, but dehumanize. They dehumanized Ukrainians, now they dehumanized also Europeans. Europeans are also supporting of fascists for them and Nazis, so we should be also aware of that. The next lesson is that Ukrainian nation is very consolidated right now.
Yeah, and this is surprising because it's not only about this core patriotic part of the society, but about almost everybody, about 100% of Ukrainians. It doesn't matter if you speak Russian or Ukrainian or what are exactly your origins. You could be half Russian or whatever, Jewish, Ukrainian, any other nationality. But when you start receiving missiles in your city, you really start understanding what's going on. In fact, so this is not about politics. This is not about culture or any kind of choice. This is about this fundamental, I would say, difference between what I call civilization and this barbaric world of Russian Empire. So, and that's why what we see now, this is an extreme strong support of the Ukrainian army. Some figures were published during these days about about money collected by volunteers to support Ukrainian army. This is something huge. It is a really huge amount of money. Because people understand that they have no choice but to defend their country and to defend those who defend your country. This is very small choice now, and we see now that this consolidation, so no future for politically Russian-oriented parties. For example, they were banned, by the way, several days or a week ago in the parliament. But
before even they were banned, they were dismantled themselves. So
yeah.
they understood that they have no future.
Yeah, that's also politically. This is it will not be working, and we can imagine that in some time when the war will be over, it will be over. We are sure of that. There will be no future for any kind of project which is Russian-centered or in any way positive about Russia, because Ukrainians will never forget this war. I mean, our generation and generation of our kids, and this is already in history. And that's why this consolidation is unprecedented. So in 2014, we also noted that there's a kind of rebirth of a nation, because the state was attacked, Crimea was annexed, and a part of Donbass was occupied. It was already creating some new life for Ukrainian nation. But what we see today, it is really unprecedented. And when the war is over, I think we'll live in a totally different context, without any sympathy, any positive narrative about Russia.
Yes, this is what is happening. The fifth lesson is that the West is doing much, but not enough. This is our impression, and we should understand that Ukrainian army is very strong, resisting, but the key danger is coming from the skies. The key danger is coming from missiles, and the West is still afraid of, giving Ukraine more air defense, more anti-missiles defense to protect its sky. So it's afraid of Russian blackmail, nuclear blackmail. But even if it is afraid, and even if we consider that these fears are justified, although I don't consider that downing Russian missiles is will change any difference in the way how Russians are approaching the West. So it will not lead to human lives, etc. Just downing Russian missiles who are coming to Ukrainian cities. But Ukraine is able to do it itself with more sophisticated anti-air defense air defense systems. But what is also very important is the economic front, because we see that sanctions are very strong, but not that strong. Mm-hmm. Some banks were switched off from SWIFT, but not all the banks. The Russian central bank is under sanction. This was very good idea, but it still is able to function. It's still able to to make other banks as its slaves, and just operate through them. We see the loopholes in sanctions. Of course, energy and gas, Russian energy and gas exports are working. According to some estimates, they're bringing $1 billion per day to Russian economy, to Russian budget. And we see those very weak, very scary remarks by, for example, German Chancellor Mr. Scholz, that Germany is not going to refuse from Russian gas and oil too quickly,
Just because they need to substitute all that. But yes, I would agree that this response from the West is strong, but it's not enough. And even in terms of arms, we do need much more, in fact, because Ukrainian army has already shown that we were able to resist to this Russian attack, but what we need now is to counterattack. And to do that, we need different sorts of arms. And today, President Zelensky addressed NATO just several hours ago, and he was saying that, look, if only you were able to give us or to sell us 1% of your arms, 1% of your tanks, or 1% of your jets, it would be enough for us. You are strong, and he's not asking much. He's not asking only for 1% of what NATO countries together they have, and it will be enough for us to counterattack Russia in an extremely effective way. So we do expect that the position of the West will be stronger in coming weeks. So we do hope, and we understand that in a way, the ultimatums coming from Putin, they were not aiming only at Ukraine. We understand that NATO also is aware that Putin is trying to attack NATO directly in a way. So we are sure that NATO countries are aware of the danger, and that they will help Ukraine much more in coming weeks than they do now.
Yes, and this war also shows that Ukrainians' interpretation of the events since 2008, since the invasion of Georgia, were correct. Because we were saying that Russia will not stop on Georgia, not stop on Donbass, not stop on Ukraine. And maybe it's time to read these Ukrainian estimations and to understand that we were correct by saying that Russians don't consider that they have any borders. So they will be stopped only at the moment when they will be stopped and when they will be kicked off.
The sixth lesson is that maybe we've learned during this month is that the civilization, contrary to what we used to think before, is a very fragile thing. Look, 1 month ago we were living lives which are in many aspects similar to what our audience live now. So we were normal people who were going to their jobs, who were raising their children, who were having many projects, etc., etc. But what we've learned already in the first days of this war, that the civilization is very fragile and everything is disappearing very quickly, starting from food, from I don't know, from possibility to pay, to withdraw cash, and then to move. You have in 1-2 days you have problems to move because there are checkpoints and you are controlled, all that. And we are lucky enough to be in Kiev, and other people like in Mariupol, they've learned quite quickly that a normal life just in the end of February could turn into a nightmare in the beginning of March already, without water, without food, without supplies, without electricity. And if you don't have electricity, you don't have connection. So, and our journalists, for example, we are receiving a lot of calls from foreign journalists at that moment. And I always forget to tell them that the Ukrainian colleagues now, people we know, our friends, they are living in basements, they're living in the underground, and they are working many hours a day, and they are unable to move in the evening to their homes because this is not safe, and some of them, they don't have home now.
Yes, and so one of the lessons is that war can happen anywhere at any moment because it's a missiles war. If you're living in a peaceful city, in 1 second, for example, your house can be destroyed. Normality can disappear in 1 day. This civilization is really very fragile. And time has changed, the perception of time, because time is not like a menu of options when you can pick up, oh, I will do something tomorrow, or maybe I will do it day after tomorrow. I can plan in a week or so. Tomorrow, the situation can be totally different. Tomorrow, you can be under occupation. The day after tomorrow, because of your decision right now, tomorrow you can be dead.
Remember, for example, during your trip to Kiev, I remember that I was looking constantly on the military reports, what was exactly going in their region, and what was the state of the road, because sometimes it changed dramatically just in a couple of hours, because they were reporting that Russian troops were moving, and that's why we were very much worried about the possible trip to any place. So you must take that into consideration. For example, a colleague of mine who is close to Mariupol now, and she tries to escape this area. She planned to move to get on the move today, but she was unable to do so because of the Ukrainian counterattack in Berdyansk, and this because of a lot of it's a battlefield now, so the road is not functioning. So it can change during the night. So you had your projects, your I would say fundamental projects to get out, and you are simply unable to do that because the battlefield situation is changing.
And one of the example is that individualism is an illusion. Because during the war, you understand how much you're dependent on other people, how much you're dependent on the civilization, how much you're dependent on the supplies of food to the supermarkets, how much you're dependent on the power plants that supply electricity to you. And many of things in which, for example, probably our audience is living in this digital economy, all those soft skills, etc., they suddenly don't work.
If you don't have electricity,
they suddenly have no value at all. Look at those people in Russia who were earning lots of money thanks to Instagram. They're now poor and jobless. The seventh lesson is that we always have to prepare in advance. It seems that, for example, when Germany says that it will reduce the dependence on Russian oil and gas, we were saying this since 10 years. And unfortunately, Europe and Germany in particular didn't do much about it. So imagine if this dependency on Russian oil and gas could be reduced, and the action would have been taken in 2014. What we would have now, for example, much harsher sanctions, much bigger hit on Russian economy, etc.
You have to calculate the risks, in fact, and it's also so on a personal level, on a level of your ordinary life. I remember that 1 month before the war started, we were discussing, do you remember that, emergency kits and all kind of things you have to pack, and there were even trainings about that. We were skeptical, but we are still following, we were just reading. I remember a huge number of articles in many media talking about what kind of medicine should you put into your bag, and what kind of actions should you take in that situation. You're never ready for the war, but it's better to be prepared. And I remember also this morning of the 24th February, and when we heard these bombs falling on our city, I remember that we didn't have any baggage, and we had to do that.
That means that we were stupid, and Ukrainian citizens were not really prepared. Many of them, Ukrainian government was also not really prepared. Let's be serious. So the heroism comes next, and this is very good. So Ukrainians have been better prepared than probably we expected, but not ideally prepared. The next lesson is that inhumanity is possible in 21st century. Sometimes we hear, how can it be possible in 21st century? Well, we would tell you that this is possible in 21st century. This will be possible in 22nd century, 25th century, 30th century, whatever century you like. Our lesson is that inhumanity doesn't have history. That means that moral progress, there is no moral progress. Technological progress doesn't lead to moral progress. We see the sagesse of Mr. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Swiss philosopher, Geneva philosopher, who told us this in 18th century. And when you have pretty civilization around you, you don't really believe it, but Mr. Jean-Jacques Rousseau knew that very well. Technological progress doesn't lead to moral progress. The inhumane, immoral, cruel things can happen using very highly sophisticated technological tools. And basically, this is what Russians is doing now, and probably will be doing it even more. This is a distant war. They understand that they will basically have no success on the land operation. They're losing lots of people. So what else they can do? They can just bomb Ukrainian cities with missiles.
And unfortunately enough, they still have a lot of missiles. But the solution for us would be to close the sky by ourselves using all these air defense systems. But yes, I would absolutely agree with you that this inhumane behavior is possible today, as it was possible in Middle Ages. So when we see, for example, that Russian soldiers are bombing hospitals, or they are killing children, in cars, when you do see this is just kids. It's not about progress. It's not about that they don't know. This is just about this inhumane behavior which could really exist now. We were skeptical about it. I do remember before the war we were talking that this is just impossible. They will not do that. We live in 21st century. Nobody would have such a war, such a conventional, war like the Second World War. It is outdated. It's not interesting. But now we understand that it was an illusion.
And one of the lessons is, for example, the demographical changes. So how Russians are using the usual tactics of deportation. But while sometimes in 1944, when they deported Crimean Tatars in just a few days, they were just used, these, the trains, the cattle trains, to bring Crimean Tatars and bring them to Central Asia. Now they use missiles. So they just bomb the cities. And of course, if you're living in the city which can be hit by a missile at every second, and you don't know, it doesn't depend on the proximity of the enemy. Because as you said today, they brought missiles from the Black Sea to Kharkiv. Kharkiv is northeast of Ukraine. So the missiles should have crossed all Ukrainian territory to get to Kharkiv. Of course, people are scared, and many of them will leave. And we now see at least 3 million people, right, of Ukrainian refugees.
3.5 million of people abroad, Ukrainians abroad, and about 12 millions on the move inside the country. So people who went to the West, for example.
Yeah, so this is what's happening. And this is also deportation, right? This is also a war crime. And this is what they tried on Syria. Now they're trying it in Europe. The ninth lesson is that Russia is a wounded empire with destructive and self-destructive impulses. What we mean by wounded empire, the same story as happened with Italy or Germany or Spain in the 20th century, when you understand that you have a big empire in the past. Like Spain had this, big legend of the empire of the 16th century when the sun never sets, right? Italians, Mussolini, Italy was having this legend of the Roman Empire. Hitler was saying that we should come back where we stopped 600 years ago in this Holy Roman Empire of German nation of the Middle Ages. And this totalitarianism basically meant a an effort to come back to this, glory of the past. Russians are doing the same. So they're doing the same. They understand that their glory is in the past, and they have been losing the territories which they consider as theirs.
And the important thing here to highlight is that Russia never had a kind of project for future. They are always referring to their past, saying that, well, in the past we were a big empire, but this was in the past, it's not in the future. So, and when you look attentively to the Russian projects, it contains nothing real about the future. That's the problem, that's the point, and that's the direct sign of the fact that they will lose this war. You cannot live without a project for future. You cannot live only referring to your past.
Exactly, and fortunately for us, Mr. Putin is a very old guy. We see his entourage also very old guys who don't really appear right now on in the media, so we don't know what happens to Mr. Shoigu, Mr. Gerasimov, etc. But really, I mean, the law of history is that you can never come back to the past. You should invent something else.
Yeah.
So when Germans, Italians, Spaniards, French, invented the European, of course, the Benelux countries, invented the European communities, they show that they're creative enough and they can invent something else. Instead of empires, they would create a commonwealth of nation states, if you like. And they were successful in it. Russia, unfortunately, is not thinking about something else. So it's trying to repeat the past of the World War II, but also the past of the Russian Empire. Putin is criticizing the Soviet Union. He's trying to come back to the Russian Empire. So he's trying to be even more archaic.
Mm-hmm. And the last lesson, maybe the most optimistic one, and we'll see how it goes, is that Ukraine, we are almost convinced that Ukraine will be a center of a new Europe after the war, certainly, because this lesson of heroism of the Ukrainian army, this lesson of mobilization of the Ukrainian society, this capacity of Ukrainian people to defend the values which are common with with European countries and Western countries in general, they show us that we are almost sure to have enough support to build a completely new country here, and will be center of this economic effort as well, because just to rebuild the country we will need a lot of efforts and money, and I am sure that we'll see a completely new city in place of Mariupol in a short time, let's hope so. And there will be a lot of solidarity efforts in the coming months or years to show that the civilization wins, because it has its own values and its style life, which is the best maybe style life possible.
Yes, and Ukrainians are showing that European values are not only good and defendable, but they are also defendable heroically, and I was very much surprised listening to many American, Western European colleagues in the past decade, and seeing how frustrated they are, how they don't see any future in these European even ideals, how they see basically that European values are now turning against themselves, and what Europe was, or democratic world was considering as big assets like freedom of speech or individual rights, they are basically turning against themselves. They become self-destructive. Why they become self-destructive? I think because they didn't really have the enemy.
Because there were no real danger.
There was no real danger, no real challenge. And you understand these values only when they're in danger, only when they're challenged. This is what Ukrainians are going through, unfortunately. And this is what I think gives Ukrainians kind of a new perspective on Europe, and an ability to inject new energy into this continent.
Yeah, and in a way, Ukraine is already in this history. So, and will always has the place in this history of the victory over Russia and over this real enemy to European civilization, European values, and European style of life.
Yeah, so we'll finish on this optimistic note. This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. This series of podcasts about the war, about Russian invasion, is brought to you by Internews Ukraine and Ukraine Crisis Media Center, two Ukrainian media NGOs. Tetyana Ogarkova, who is in charge of international outreach of Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Myself, Volodymyr Yermolenko, chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. And stay with us, listen to our podcast, advise to your friends and colleagues. You can listen to us on SoundCloud, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and stand with us and stand with Ukraine.